Okay, we'll go ahead and start. So welcome everyone to our June edition of our Science Communications webinar. I just want to give you a couple reminders as we get started. Please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted during the presentation. You can put your questions in the chat as we go along. And at the end of the presentation, I'll read out your questions that are in the chat. And of course, y'all can provide some more questions at the end. But today we have Emily Nastas as our presenter on research she's conducted with a Henslow sparrow with Dr. Jaime Collazo. So Emily is a PhD student at NC State University, where she's studying the ecology and genetic structure of the Henslow sparrow populations in North Carolina. Emily earned her BS in biology and her BFA in scientific illustration from Virginia Commonwealth University. Before she started her graduate degree at NC State, Emily worked as a science communicator at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, where she helped conduct ecosystem health assessments. After earning her degree at NC State, Emily hopes to conserve threatened species in vulnerable landscapes by developing spatial models of natural resources and species distributions. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Emily. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, just again to reiterate, my name is Emily Nastas, and I'm a PhD student at NC State University. And I'm really excited to get to share with you about my dissertation research on the demography, habitat use, and genetic structure of Henslow sparrows in North Carolina. So before I jump into some of the cool analysis and results that we've gotten, I thought I'd share a little background about the Henslow sparrow. Maybe some of you aren't birders or you're not familiar with the species. So the Henslow sparrow is a grassland specialist migratory songbird. And from what we know of the species' natural history, it's believed that there were actually two subspecies of Henslow sparrows that were separated in its breeding range initially. We have the Western Henslowii subspecies that was found in the Great Plains out west, and we had the Eastern Susurron subspecies, which was mostly found along the Northeast Atlantic coast. And as humans moved through the landscape and clear-cut forests and opened up agricultural fields, they actually sort of paved the way for these two subspecies to merge in their breeding ranges, where in the early 1900s, we're seeing the largest breeding extent for the Henslow sparrows that we're aware of. And unfortunately, that large extent did not last forever. So as of the mid-1900s, we've actually been seeing steady population declines of Henslow sparrows throughout its breeding range. These population declines are mostly attributed to habitat loss and fragmentation, land cover change, fire suppression, basically things that are reducing the availability of native grasslands in North America. Something else you'll notice from this map here is that where we used to see that eastern subspecies along the Atlantic coast, we're not really seeing populations of Henslow sparrows there anymore. And what is left along the East Coast is pretty much in North Carolina. So these are the birds I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's also worth noting, though, that this population in North Carolina is actually quite far geographically from the next closest breeding population, which may have some significant conservation impacts for these birds. So the North Carolina Henslow sparrows are mostly located at the Voice of America Game Land and the Voice of America Site B radio transmission facility. These are the only two breeding sites that we're aware of for the species in this region. So many of you are probably familiar with the Voice of America Game Land. It's a site that's owned and managed by the WRC. So you guys have taken down radio towers that used to be on the site, and you're now using prescribed fire to manage this grassland habitat that you see here. If we compare this to the Voice of America Site B, which is an active radio broadcasting facility, they have radio towers still erected on site, and they are using mowing to manage the property. So even though the sites are very similar in size and structure, they are managed differently, and these are going to have significant implications on the amount of Henslows that are occupying these two sites. So I'll talk a little bit about both of these populations, but I am mostly focusing on the Voice of America Gameland population. I have a lot more data for this particular site, and accessing the Gameland was much easier than accessing an active broadcasting facility. So again, you may already know this as you are the WRC, but the Gameland is currently being managed with prescribed fire on a 3-year burn rotation across the 6 management units that are on site. So these management units are labeled A through F. And just for a quick example of what this may look like, management units A and F may be burned together in 1 year, and then units B and E could be burned together in the next year, and then units D and C may be burned together. So after 3 years, the entire site will have been burned once over, but within the site, we're seeing this mosaic of vegetation structure that varies based on when a unit was burned. So keep this in mind when we talk about some of the analysis that we've done a little bit later. So that was all background on the Henslow sparrow and on their breeding sites here in North Carolina, but what are we actually doing in this research? So for my research, we are really trying to lay the foundation to conduct a status assessment for Henslow sparrows in North Carolina. So we're trying to address the population's resiliency, redundancy, and representation. And those are really just kind of buzzwords to say that we're trying to assess the population status, you know, how these populations are doing currently and over time, why they're choosing these particular sites to return to each year. As far as their distribution in the region, we wanted to see if perhaps there were other populations nearby that we just are unaware of currently, because it is a little far-fetched to believe that maybe there are only 2 sites that these birds will go to each year in North Carolina. And then as for representation, that's just kind of a fancy way to say we're looking at the genetic structure of these populations. We want to assess if the North Carolina birds are genetically distinct from Western populations, which again is a very plausible explanation because of that geographic separation that we're seeing between the populations. But also we wanted to look to see if there is maybe some indication that that eastern subspecies still persists in North Carolina. No one has actually conducted a genetic assessment of the species, so we're not really sure if that eastern subspecies exists anymore or if it's been merged into the western subspecies. So we're hoping our genetic data can address that as well. And then we added this 4th component called species viability. This is where we're trying to take all of the data that we've gathered up till this point over the past 4 years and project it out into the future and see, are these populations sustainable? Are they going to be viable into the future? Are things like climate change going to threaten these populations over time? So really that's to try to bundle up everything and look out into the future and see if these populations are going to stay in North Carolina. So I'll go through each of these separately, and I'm really skipping over the methods here. So if you have questions about methods, definitely ask me at the end, but I'm really focusing on some of the cooler analysis and results that we've done so far. So if we're looking at species resiliency, my first real question is just, how are these populations doing demographically? We want to look at abundances and growth rates and reproduction at these sites. You know, are these populations sustainable over time? So if we first look at the Voice of America Gameland, this site, I was very fortunate to have inherited a 10-year data set on point counts at the property, thanks to the WRC. So we actually have a long-term data set here that spans from 2011 to now 2023, where we can estimate population abundances using distance sampling models. So to answer this question, how is the population doing over time? What does our growth rate look like? This is what we're seeing from our models. So the population size is fluctuating annually, where we're seeing some increases and some decreases over time. But overall, we're seeing a pretty significant upward trend across the 13 years. And that's estimated at about 16% growth annually, which is a pretty large growth rate for a vulnerable songbird species. So looking at this, we also wondered if there was maybe support to suggest that our growth rate may be changing over time. As you can probably see in this graph, we have much lower population abundances for the first few years of the data set, and then it really starts to take off in the last 4 years or so. So we ran a piecewise regression, and we found that, yes, there was actually support to suggest that there are 2 different growth rates happening here. So for the first 9 years or so, we're seeing a lower growth rate where about 10 singing males are added to the population each year. But in the last 4 years, we're seeing that growth rate actually multiplies by about 6 times over, where now we're getting about 66 birds added to the population each year, which is a much higher and faster growth rate. We can speculate about what is causing the differences in growth rates over time. You know, some things that come to mind are that the fire management at the site is really taking off and making the habitat just really suitable for these birds, or perhaps demographic rates throughout the annual cycle are actually doing really well in recent years. You know, maybe survival on the wintering grounds is really high in recent years compared to when it was lower in the past. So unfortunately, we can't specifically answer that with what we're seeing, but we can say with some confidence that the growth rate is changing over time, and in recent years, it's accelerating much faster. So I actually did not plot our population abundances for Site B. I only have 3 years of data, so it wouldn't be a particularly good graph. But I'll just go ahead and tell you that the estimates we're getting at Site B are about a half to maybe a third of the population size of the game land. So really that's telling us that sites that are mowed are supporting much lower population abundances than a site like the game land, which is managed with fire. Something else we're looking at for demographic rates in this population is getting an idea of site fidelity and return rates to the property. So with some of the color banded birds that we've tagged over the past 3 years, we're finding that anywhere from about 22 to 38% of our color banded birds are returning from the year that we tagged it to the next year, which is a very high return rate for songbird species, but it's especially high for the Henslow sparrow because Henslows are actually not known for having high site fidelity. They're actually known for the opposite, which is that they have high dispersal rates and they're pretty unreliable on their breeding sites. So this finding was really interesting, that these birds are returning in high volume to the game land each year. And of the birds that are returning, we found that nearly 80% of the ones that we recaptured were found within 200 meters of their original capture location. So all of these dots on this map over here represent subsequent capture events. So each is color-coded by a year. And then the gray lines connect subsequent recaptures for the same individual. So you can see that for the most part, these birds are being found very close to where we initially capture them. And then on top of all of this, our monitoring data suggests that we're not getting a lot of natural mortalities in the adult population during the summer season. So when we monitor birds from April through July, we were not able to confirm any bird had died of natural causes, so predation or disease. Most, if not all, sometimes of our birds would stay on their territories for the entire summer season, and we were able to re-site them. So all of these things taken together is suggesting that we have high summer survival, high rates of return. You know, that suggests high survival on the wintering grounds potentially. So overall, these things are suggesting that this population can sustain the really high population abundances that we're observing with our other data set. So another really key component to assessing demographics in a population is to look at breeding productivity, because you know the amount of breeding productivity will have serious implications on a population growth rate and abundances over time. So with this, we located and monitored nests over 2 summer seasons. We only found 27, but we are very proud of the 27 that we found, because that is some serious work that we did to find those 27 nests. And of the 27 that we found, 24 were successful at fledging at least one individual from the nest. But on average, we're seeing something more like 3.3 chicks are being fledged per nest. We also saw evidence of multiple broods being conducted by breeding pairs each summer, where several individuals were confirmed to have double brooded. But based on the timing of breeding events, we do believe it's really possible that these birds are conducting more like 3 broods across the summer season at the Gameland. And we used all of our nesting data and we plugged them into some nest survival models. And we found that the average survival probability across a 24-day nest cycle is close to about 82%. So actually like a pretty high rate of survival in these nests that we've found. But survival differs whether the nest is in the egg stage or the nestling stage. So from what we found, the egg stage is going to be more vulnerable and more likely to be predated compared to the nestling stage, which has a very high success rate overall. And so here our biggest predictor was that a nest survival will increase with the age of the nest or like the time that it's out in the field. So all of this taken together is really indicating that these birds are extremely productive at this site. They are cranking out chicks and broods, and they have pretty good survival rates as far as we can tell. Although I do just want to caveat this by saying that our sample size is pretty low. We only had 27 nests, so there could be some level of bias here. Okay, so now we can move on to our next question. Are there other sites in North Carolina that Henslow sparrows are breeding at? So again, this was motivated just by our suspicions that it's maybe unlikely that there are only 2 viable grasslands that these birds can use in the state. So for 2 summers, we searched grasslands in the coastal plains region of North Carolina, and we surveyed a total of 80 sites over the 2 years. We really focused on sites that had previous records of Henslows or that were nearby the existing populations. So that's what these clusters are here and here. They're sites that are immediately surrounding the 2 VOA properties. And over the 2 years, we collected, I don't know, like 400,000 recordings at these properties. And when we analyzed them for the Henslow sparrow song, we found no evidence of other breeding populations in this region. So I guess that's not to say that there aren't other properties that Henslow sparrows are breeding at in the state, but that is to say that we were unsuccessful at finding them in this study. So I think we could really expand this work by surveying other grasslands in the region or even resurveying some of the ones that we did survey. But for now, our evidence is pointing that these 2 VOA properties continue to be the only breeding sites that we're aware of, and they're very, very important to Henslow sparrow persistence in North Carolina. So now we can move on to our next question. Why are these birds continuing to come to the VOA sites? And what is it about the vegetation specifically that these birds are selecting at the VOA properties? So this is a very big question to ask. So we had to break it down. We looked at it at 4 different levels where we assessed it on a landscape scale, and then we kind of zoomed all the way into the nest site level to see what are they selecting for on a broad scale versus on a really fine scale. So I'll go through each of these. So at a landscape scale, what we did was we conducted a supervised classification of the region that's immediately surrounding the 2 VOA properties. So our sites are outlined in black. So this is the Gameland up here, and this is Site B south of the Gameland. And what we found was that grasslands actually comprise about 23% of this region. So all of that fluorescent green color was indicated to be grasslands by my supervised classification. It was a lot more grasslands than I was originally expecting because I had this hunch that the area was dominated by forest cover. I mean, and that is true to some extent. We did find that about 51% of the surrounding area is forests if you combine evergreen forests and deciduous vegetation. But really these grasslands, even though there's a lot of it available to a Henslow sparrow, many of them are not going to be suitable because maybe they're agricultural sites or they're people's yards, or they're technically grasslands, but they're maybe the wrong vegetation structure because the species seems to require pretty specific vegetation at their breeding sites. And in addition to that, the available grasslands are much, much smaller than the two VOA properties. You can sort of see it on this map, but the game land in Site B were by far the largest grassland parcels available to birds in this region. They're running at about 1,200 hectares apiece, whereas everything else in this region was much smaller than that. And so Henslows are known for being an area sensitive species, and so they are going to select the largest available grassland parcel to them in the region. So we think that's a huge driving force as to why the birds are continuing to select the two VOA sites when they have other options in the region. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, once they've selected the VOA sites, how are they distributing themselves within these properties? For this one, we really just focused in on the game land. Again, this is where I actually have some real data that we could analyze. But we took our population abundance data and we stratified it by management units. And basically what we found was that population densities always seemed to be highest in areas that were burned about 2 years prior. And then on top of that, management units were not created equal either. So certain units always seem to have higher densities compared to others. So for example, units A and B always seem to have higher densities of sparrows compared to units E and F. So this, again, we can speculate. If you've been to the site before, this may make sense to you, but units A and B are two of the largest units by area. They have a lot of grassland available. They have fewer gravel roads that cut through the units, and they also are not flanked by this road that runs along the western and southern perimeter of the site. So since these birds are, again, area sensitive and grassland obligate, they're probably going to demonstrate some level of avoidance for man-made structures and wetlands and things of that nature. So the landscape composition is going to have an impact on how the birds are distributing themselves within the site. So now if we zoom in one more time, now that the birds have selected more broadly within the property, can we relate certain vegetation characteristics to bird activity more specifically? With this, we conducted an occupancy study, and basically what we found was that higher levels of breeding activity seem to be correlated with higher percentages of grass cover. I kind of feel like that's a no-brainer. It's a grassland obligate species. But where we had larger patches of grasses, we tended to have much more breeding activity present versus areas that had more dead stems or even live stems tended to reduce the amount of breeding activity that we found. And again, I think this makes sense, but basically this is going to be an inverse relationship between grass cover and other vegetation types, right? So as grass cover increases, the number of dead stems and live stems is probably going to decrease and vice versa. Something else that we looked at within the patch level was the home ranges of these birds. So we radio tagged, about 22 individuals each year, and we monitored their movements from April through the end of July. And we found that home range sizes averaged about 2.6 hectares. And interestingly, home range sizes did not significantly differ between management units or between the vegetation structure. So based on when each unit was previously burned. You might think that 2.6 hectares sounds like a lot of area for a small bird, and I would agree. It sounds like a huge area for one little bird to cover. But just keep in mind that this is not just the defended territory, it's everywhere that bird is going for the entire 4 months that we monitored it, where it's feeding fledglings or it's just sourcing food, stuff like that. But it was very interesting to us that home range sizes did not differ significantly, especially between time since last burn states, because if you remember, time since last burn seemed to affect the density of birds throughout the property. So what this is telling us is that areas that have more density of birds, they still maintain the same home range sizes as areas that have a lower density of birds. So basically, we don't think that bird density is affecting home range size or having any kind of negative impact on the population as of yet. So basically, we think there's probably still room for more birds to be packed into the game land currently. Something else that we found based on our radio tag data was that birds that are arriving at the site, sometime in mid-March or maybe early April, they are sticking around until well into September. So maybe even October. So this is again telling us that these birds are staying at the Voice of America game land for at least 6 months out of the year. So they're relying on this particular property for more than half of their life cycle. So again, I think that just really makes the point that these sites are very important to Henslow sparrows throughout their annual cycle. Okay, so we'll zoom in one more time now, get down to the really fine scale question. What are birds selecting at their nest sites with habitat structure? So with this, we have actually 3 separate questions that we wanted to ask. The first being, does habitat structure differ meaningfully between successful and unsuccessful nests? This question was guided by the hypothesis that maybe predation is going to be more common with certain vegetation characteristics, like if the nest is less concealed or if the vegetation height is lower in a certain area, maybe other animals are going to be able to predate these nests a little bit easier. We also wanted to ask if nest sites differed from randomly sampled plots that are nearby. And when I say nearby, I mean within 50 meters. So the question here is at a moderate scale, are birds selecting specific habitat patches or a size of a patch to put their nests within? And then at the largest scale, we wanted to compare nest site habitat structure with the average vegetation structure throughout the entire property. What kind of selection decisions are these birds making within the entire site? So I'll go ahead and answer 2 of these pretty quickly. We found that there were no significant differences in habitat structure between successful and unsuccessful nests. So basically what we're saying is that a predation event is more or less random, or at least it's not correlated with particular habitat features. But again, if you recall, I only had 3 nests that were unsuccessful out of 27 total. So we have a very small sample size here. As for nest sites being compared to randomly surveyed plots that are 50 meters away, we found that there were no differences between these 2 vegetation plots. So what this is telling us is that birds are selecting a very large habitat patch to put their nest in. So basically, if the bird is faced with, a very large homogeneous grass patch, something that's at least 1 to 2 hectares in size, they could nest anywhere in that large grassland patch. There's not really vegetation structure that gives us clues as to where these birds might be found. And that's really advantageous to a grassland species because it means that predators aren't really going to have clues about where to find nests. And unfortunately, nest searchers also don't have clues as to where to find nests. So that made nest searching very difficult for us. And then finally, our last question for nest sites was, do nest sites differ from just the average structure throughout the game land? And we found that yes, that was the case. If we look at this graph here, our vegetation plots were coded in green and our nest plots are coded in black. And you can tell that they are pretty much, with just a few exceptions, they're pretty much segregated onto the 2 sides of this graph, indicating that they are significantly different in a lot of vegetation features. Where a nest site on this side is going to be characterized by a higher amount of grasses in the area, definitely more litter, maybe more live woody vegetation. But the average vegetation plot at the game land is going to have a lot more dead and alive stems nearby, and then also taller vegetation heights overall. So there are measurable differences between random vegetation plots across the site and nest sites. So birds are making some real habitat selection decisions, and the whole site is not considered uniform or or at least not uniformly suitable for nest sites. Okay, so that was a lot of habitat use that I just covered. So I just wanted to quickly recap what we saw at each level. So at the landscape scale, we're seeing that birds do need these very large grassland patches, and that sites that are burned tend to support higher abundances than sites that are mowed. Within sites, we're seeing that bird density is not uniform. They are selecting areas that were burned 2 years prior, and that landscape features are going to have an impact on where birds are distributing themselves. Within patches, home ranges averaged about 2.6 hectares, and they really are characterized by a high amount of grass cover and lower levels of stems nearby. And at the nest sites, there is some selection occurring throughout the site where nests are significantly different from just the overall vegetation structure, and they really need a significant size homogeneous grassland patch to nest within. All right, so now we get to move on to our next question, which is, are the North Carolina Henslow sparrows genetically distinct from other populations? And I think the biggest, maybe flashiest question that we're hoping to answer is whether or not that eastern subspecies still exists in North Carolina. So this is a really nice figure that I borrowed from an article written by Brian Watts, where he's comparing two museum specimens, where on the left we have the eastern susurrans subspecies, and on the right we have the western Henslowii subspecies. And you can already just tell from this picture that the eastern subspecies has what appears to be a much larger bill compared to the western birds. And it's believed that maybe these morphological differences in the eastern and western subspecies are derived from like slight differences in the habitats that they're selecting, or even the prey base that they're utilizing in these different sites. And something you can't really see in this picture is that the eastern birds are also thought to have a slightly darker plumage than the western birds. So to address this, we are collecting genetic samples from across the species breeding range. The goal here is to get a representative sample from east to west. That way we can compare the genetic structure across the entire species range. So these black dots all represent sampling locations that we've collected. We were mostly collecting blood samples from extant populations where possible, and the number of samples is indicated by these numbers in parentheses next to the dots. But where we were unable to get samples from blood, we actually used museum specimens. So we would get small cuts of toe pads from voucher specimens. And you'll also notice that here in North Carolina, I have a much larger sample size from the Gameland and from Site B. And the point of this is to look more specifically at demographic rates within the populations here. We can use these higher sample sizes in North Carolina to really look at allele diversity, rates of inbreeding, maybe see if there's any kind of migration or gene flow occurring between the two VOA sites, or if they're acting as independent, isolated populations. So having a larger sample size here was really important to this study. You'll also see that we did end up collecting a lot of samples along the wintering range. That was really just opportunistic because I met a lot of motivated researchers along the Gulf Coast that were willing to get me samples from Henslow sparrows in this part of the range. We're not doing anything with them currently, but we are hoping that maybe after this dissertation is done, we can do like a population assignment study to see if we can assess migratory connectivity between the breeding range and the wintering range. Unfortunately, I don't have anything else to share about the genetics up till now. We are using low coverage whole genome sequencing to analyze these populations, and we just got all of our data back from the sequencer a couple weeks ago, and these files are just massive and they take forever to process in our scripts. So we are actively working on it, but I wish I had something I could share today. So if you stay tuned in the next month or so, I'm really hoping we'll have some genetic results to share, and hopefully it'll be really interesting as well. All right, so that was everything that we've done for the dissertation and for the status assessment portion of my research. But then we added this other question about population viability, which was basically, how is climate change maybe going to affect either the management of these Henslows or the Henslow sparrow populations themselves going into the future? So I sort of broke this down into three additional questions. So again, one thing that we're very interested in is, how will climate change maybe affect the burn windows at the Voice of America game land? And this, I think, is really important to look at, because if for some reason the WRC is not able to burn the game land in the future, climate prohibits this from happening in the ideal time frame, we could very quickly lose the ideal habitat for Henslow sparrows. So we wanted to just sort of quantify this threat moving forward to see if there may need to be decisions made about the timing of burns and such into the future. The next question we had was just, are climate conditions going to affect Henslow sparrow populations more directly? So this is something that would be outside of the ability for conservation managers to handle. You can't control precipitation or temperatures in a region. So if these things are affecting populations, it's worth knowing whether these population fluctuations could be affected by something that's out of your control, for example. And then finally, we wanted to bundle all of this, so everything from the status assessment and everything from our climate assessment, into a population viability model, something that would allow us to project out into the future and tell us with some confidence how might certain decisions or certain scenarios affect these Henslow sparrows into the future. So I'll go through each of these, and I'll go kind of quick. I know I'm running out of time. So for our first question, how are future projected climate conditions going to affect Henslow sparrow management or burn opportunities at the game land? I took climate projections out until 2099, and I looked at two different climate scenarios. So on the left, we have RCP 4.5. That's, a moderate to low scenario where the global population has really worked to curb climate emissions. So we're seeing like not as extreme conditions in the future. And then on the right, I have RCP 8.5, and this is where we're continuing business as usual, and we haven't really curbed any kind of emissions. And so climate conditions are going to become much more extreme and variable in the future. You can see with the less extreme scenario, it's more or less random whether our given months are blue or red. So in this case, red indicates a net loss of burn opportunities based on prescribed burn thresholds, whereas blue represents months where maybe there might be an actual increase in the percentage of days that are available for burning. But if we look at the more extreme climate scenario, RCP 8.5, there's a very clear pattern where moving into the late century, so something like 30 to 50 years from now, we're seeing a lot of loss of burn windows in June, July, and August specifically. And this is actually really important for the Voice of America site, because that is actually right when you are currently conducting your burns, is late July and going into August. So based on this just preliminary assessment, it looks like late in the century, depending on emissions and the climate scenarios that we have, there may need to be some decisions about the timing of conducting burns, because it would be hard to accomplish your habitat management goals with such a reduction in the number of burn days available to you. So again, this was just to kind of get a relative level of threat of how climate change may affect management in the future. If we look at specifically how climate conditions are affecting the sparrow populations, this is an analysis we just did last week, so this is like hot off the press. So it's a little bit hard to understand. I still struggle with how to interpret this graph, but basically I looked at population abundance data and I compared it to spring rain and spring temperatures of the same year and found that the interaction between precipitation and temperature has a not so straightforward effect on population size. So to step you through this graph, what we're seeing here is if we have lower than average rains in a spring, but higher than average temperatures, population size is going to be higher. Whereas if we have higher than average rain and higher than average temperatures, population size will be lower. But if we come over here, we have lower than average rain and lower than average temperatures, we might have a higher population size, but higher than average rain and lower than average temperatures may cause lower population sizes. So again, it's just not a straightforward relationship. It just means that the interaction between rain and temperature may affect populations, but it may not be very straightforward. And again, this is something that's, you know, out of the control of a conservation manager. And this may be something that explains some of those population fluctuations we were seeing in our 13 years of data from the game land. All right, moving on to our population viability models. What we're hoping to do with all of the data we've collected so far is to create a population viability model and calibrate it with our 13 years of data. If we can create a model that uses our best guesstimates of some of these demographic rates and what we're seeing in a population over time, and if we can get a model that accurately represents that, you know, that 16% growth rate that we're seeing across the 13 years, we can then project with this model into the future and ask different questions about the population. So we can ask things like, are certain parameters more sensitive than others in the population? So would breeding productivity have more of an impact or on population abundance compared to like adult survival, for example? But something else we could look at are more like climate and management questions. So again, coming back to that idea of like when to do burns in a season, you know, how would moving a burn schedule affect population abundances in subsequent years? That's something we can look at with a model like this. So that's really what we're hoping to do sort of at the culmination of all of this, is bring it all together, project out some possible scenarios into the future, and just get an idea of, you know, how sustainable or not these populations are based on what we've gathered so far. All right, I know I've already run over on time, so I'm just going to wrap up with this and say that these two populations in North Carolina at the VOA sites, they're both pretty large, they're growing over time, and they seem like they're doing quite well. They keep returning, and they seem to really like these two VOA sites. But we know that having just two breeding properties in North Carolina is a really precarious situation to be in for a threatened songbird. So we believe that without conservation management actions, like what the WRC is implementing at the game land, we could very quickly see the loss of Henslow sparrows in North Carolina in just a number of years. And so I'll just end it there and say thank you guys so much for inviting me to present today. This was really great to get to share some of my research, and definitely a special thank you to my advisor, Jaime, and John Carpenter at the Commission for his help in the field and all of the data, and definitely everybody that's helped me collect data and analyze it. You're always more than welcome to email me if you want to follow up on something, but I think we have some time for questions now as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That's really an amazing amount of work that you've been doing. I appreciate it. So everybody, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. And we have some time now to ask various things. I see there's one question already in the chat. Brian Sharp asks, what are the differences between live stems and live woody vegetation in your habitat assessment?
Yeah, so a lot of times live stems are sort of related to the live woody vegetation that we found in an area, but we quantified them differently. So one is telling you the actual count of the number of stems that are perchable that the birds could use versus just like a relative percent cover of a given space. So they kind of address the same thing, but they're two different measures of that thing.
Okay. And the second question from Brian is the wintering range of the North Carolina population known?
No, so we have been unsuccessful at recapturing our birds on the wintering range. To my knowledge, no one actually has been able to find them along the Gulf Coast. So we don't actually know with any confidence where our birds are going. We did deploy some geolocators 2 years ago, and I got one back of the 12 that I sent out. And when I analyzed the data, it was telling me the bird went to Iowa. So basically, if we assume that, you know, there's more error in the latitude versus the longitude, if you kind of drop it down, it looks like that bird would have been in the Florida Panhandle or maybe southern Georgia. But that's a sample size of one, and it's not very reliable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe with our high site fidelity, somebody could put out some more of those geolocators.
Oh, yeah.
And get some more back.
For sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I have one question for you. I kind of know how you search for Henslow sparrow nests, but other people don't know. So maybe if you could explain that, and given that method, how likely is it that a cowbird would use the same method?
Sure. So we found nests in 3 ways. The first was we would take, you know, a 1 meter long bamboo stick. We would have 2 of them, and we would just kind of walk through the grassland, and we would just kind of ruffle up different clumps of grass. And basically, if a bird shoots out of the grass, that's a really good indication that she was just sitting on a nest and she was waiting till the last possible minute to jump off the nest. So then you would search that immediate vicinity to find the nest. And again, it's extremely difficult because even when that happens, you know, you could be searching the same clump for 10 minutes and not find this nest. It's incredible. The second way is to follow behavioral cues. So if you see a bird that's carrying a bug, they'll, you know, dive down repeatedly to the same spot if they're feeding on a nest. So the birds are very particular when they're doing this, and they don't want to lead predators to their nests. So they won't do this if you're too close to them. So you pretty much have to be 100 meters away watching a bird dive into a grass clump, and then you have to zoom over there as fast as you can to see which clump they went into and try to search that clump. So also very difficult to do. And the last way that we found a nest, and we only found one this way, was just by accident. It's just walking through the field, and you flush out a bird, and there you go, there's your nest. So it's definitely tough work. And as far as the cowbird question goes, other studies have found cowbirds to predate henslows, you know, use their nests and use them as a host. But we did not see any cowbird eggs in any of our nests. There are cowbirds at the site, so I definitely think it's plausible that they are using henslow nests, but these nests are extremely concealed. So as far as we can tell, they've done a pretty good job protecting themselves.
That's good. Yeah, good. Yes. So just one other question I have is, with habitat adjacent to VOA game land, what would be some of your suggestions on how to give incentives to the landowners or otherwise manage those adjacent sites for Henslow sparrow and other grassland species?
Yeah, if the WRC or some other agency is available to acquire some of the adjacent, especially the connected properties, I would suggest managing it just like you are the game land. Try to make it as large and contiguous, as possible. And fire seems to really rejuvenate the grassland and make it much more productive. So if possible, do that. Also, getting rid of some like tree lines and stuff like that. I mean, henslows really like open fields. I wouldn't know how to incentivize landowners to help with this, except to say, you know, if they're bird lovers, maybe they would be amenable to the idea. You know, you're conserving some really critical wildlife that is only found in this part of North Carolina. But beyond that, I wouldn't know how to get them to help out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I'll ask one more question. So what other species, plants and animals, benefit from the management of the sites that are managed for Henslow sparrows?
Yeah, so as far as birds go, I mean, there is just an abundance of really cool grassland bird species that are found out there. Some stuff that I think would be somewhat rare for this region. You know, for example, we found a dickcissel at the site last year, which is not that common in this area. And there's a barn owl. Nope. We have some owls that definitely utilize the site. Yeah, it was a barn owl, I think, that likes the old building on the property. And we've seen like sedge wrens and stuff like that. Definitely lots of harriers. But as for the plant community, there's also just some really amazing plants out there, like orchids that benefit from the fire. Really cool carnivorous plants. We've got just at least 2 kinds of pitcher plants out there, and the sundews. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a plant person, so I'm not that good at identifying plants, but I know a lot of people travel to the VOA site to see some of the plant community in addition to the fauna as well. So I think it's a really special property, and it's just so unique to this region that managing it the way that you are, I think, is doing such a great job at having a unique community there.
Yeah, and Jeff Bean asks, did you ever get a lark sparrow at the site?
I haven't seen a lark sparrow there, and you know, I'd have to look at previous records to see if someone else has, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe one came through in passing. It seems to be good stopover habitat for birds as well.
Yeah, seems to be a really popular site for birders to go to.
Oh yeah, it's a hugely popular birding site. Birders come every day.
Yeah. Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming and giving this work. It's a tremendous amount of work, and it's going to be so helpful. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. And like I said, if anybody has any follow-up questions, you're welcome to email me. I'm always around.
Okay, thanks. And one quick thing before we leave, the next this recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel. So as soon as it's available, we'll send out an email to everybody to let you know. And then also next month, we're going to get a presentation from WRC's Casey Phillips, and he's going to present information on RASP, which is Recovery and Sustainment Program. So thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks again, Emily. It's great.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.